Welcome to the SPSS tutorial video for manipulating data, data files, and output. Today I'll show you how to standardize variables, recode variables, center variables at the mean, create composite variables, select cases, and shrink tables in the output, as well as saving output to a Word file. The dataset I'll be using for this video is new, so let me briefly describe the variables. As you can see, we're in variable view, and each person will have an ID. This is the random participant ID that's used in many research studies. We also indicate a therapy type. This is a therapy data set, so each person in our data are involved in either a control or no therapy, a CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, or a humanistic therapy. We also have depression scores at time 1 and time 2. Each person is coded for participant sex, right, where 0 is coded as male and 1 is female. Each person also has an optimism score and a socioeconomic status score. The first analysis I would like to describe is how to standardize variables. In many classes this is called z-scores. To standardize variables, if you go up to the descriptives menu under Analyze, just like you would be pulling up descriptive statistics, let's select over depression at time 1 is already over. Let's move depression at time 2, as well as optimism, all of our continuous variables. Most of the time I've asked you to look at options and select the mean or standard deviation. In this case, something I haven't mentioned yet is this small checkbox that says Save Standardized Values as Variables. When we click OK, it indicates which variables, it shows their descriptive statistics, but more importantly, the standardized variables under Data View are saved in new files. You can see it indicates the z-score for depression 1, z-score for depression 2, as well as the z-score for optimism. Now we have standardized variables for the data already in the file saved in our data view. Next, I want to show you how to recode a variable. The first thing we'll do is we'll recode our therapy variable. Instead of having them say, are they under no therapy, humanistic therapy, or CBT therapy, let's code this 3-level variable into 2. To do this, we'll go to Transform and recode into different variables. Importantly, if you choose recode into the same variable, it will replace what's already in your data set with the new one you create. The much safer way is to recode into a different variable so that you won't be taking away your old data. Now we have to choose which variable in our file is going to be recoded. In this case it's therapy type, and we'll give it a new label. We'll just call it therapy, and our label will be therapy yes no. We'll give this new variable the name therapy, and we'll call it therapy yes or no to indicate that we've changed it from a 3-level to a yes or no variable. Notice that I click change and the new name showed up in this window. If the new name is not showing up in this window, it won't allow you to continue. So we'll click to old and new values. Previously, if you'll recall, in our 3-level variable we were coded 1 as a control where they got no therapy, 2 as CBT, and 3 as humanistic. In this case, we'll allow the 1 to remain the same. We clicked 1 for both an old and a new value, and we'll click to add. This means that if they were in the control, they get the same code. Now we'll recode the CBT into a new category that's also they get therapy, and we'll code the same humanistic also gets a 2. Now you can see that before we had levels of 1, 2, and 3 for control, CBT, and humanistic respectively, and instead we're recoding this into 2 categories where 1 is our control and 2 is any therapy group. If we click continue and OK, all we see in our output is a small code or a small content here saying that it worked correctly. But if we minimize, we can see that a new therapy variable shows up in our window. You should be able to look across and show that if they had a 1 in therapy before, they still have a 1 for therapy in the new variable. But as we scroll down, you can notice that whether they had a 3 or a 2 before, indicating humanistic or CBT therapy, they got a 2 in the new variable. Now we can run tests, for example, to determine whether getting no therapy is better than any therapy at all, or whether the type of therapy matters. This illustrates how to recode a categorical variable, but what about recoding a continuous variable? Let's take our optimism score, for example. What if we wanted to ask who is high and low in optimism and create groups out of each? To do this, we would first look at the descriptive statistics for optimism, I'll get rid of the depression variables here, but optimism will look at the descriptive statistics, and we'll note that the mean is 56.29. Because that's the mean, we'll say that anyone above this score of 56, just to round it off, will be given a high score of optimism, and anyone below a 56 will be given a low score of optimism. If we come to transform and recode into different variables again, I'll delete this. If we choose our optimism variable now, we can rename this optimism high-low, for example. Again, we'll hit change, go into old and new values. We have to remove what we just did from the previous one. Instead of inserting old values, because optimism is a continuous score, we would say range, where we select the lowest of the optimism scores through 56. And the new value would be given a 1. We'll add this to our data. We'll then click the range of, let's say, 56.01, right? So nothing between 56 and 56.01 will give them a new value of 2. Now we can see that this continuous variable of optimism, now if they're below the mean of 56, they're given a value of 1 to indicate low optimism group, or if they're higher than the mean, they're given a value of 2 to indicate the high optimism group. We click continue and OK. Again, the output doesn't show much, but if we click on our data and scroll over, we can see that we now have an optimism high and low category. Next, let's look at centering variables at the mean. Let's use optimism again. We know that our mean was 56, so to transform a variable at its mean, you go to compute variables. This is going to create a new variable, and we'll call it C optimism, or COPT for short. To center a variable, you select the variable itself, and then you subtract, I had a minus on my screen, and the mean. This was 56.23, I believe. Once you do this, simply click OK. Again, it shows that it worked correctly. And if we go to our new variable, we can see that half the scores are above 0, half the scores are below 0. This indicates that we've centered the variable. Next, for some classes, you'll be asked to create composite variables. This is typically done when you have a scale of, say, 10 depression items, and you want to create one depression score instead of having each question having their own score. In this case, let's create a composite of our 2 depression scores, depression time 1 and 2. In an actual research case, this wouldn't make much sense, but for the sake of showing you how to create composites, it works just fine. Again, we'll go into transform and compute a new variable. We'll delete what was in there before, and we'll call this new score DEP, or depression total. That makes sense. Together we'll simply highlight depression at time 1 and add that with depression at time 2 to create a sum score, or a composite score. We can click OK. Again, not a lot shows up in our output, but when we look over in our data file, we see a new score where it's added the scores of depression at time 1 and depression at time 2 for our composite depression score. Next, another useful tool for SPSS is selecting cases. Let's say, for example, that we want to look at depression or optimism scores only for people who are in therapy, and we don't want to consider those who are not in therapy. To do this, we'll do a split file, or select cases. Under data, we can come over split file, and what's highlighted as the default is analyze all cases. Most of the time this is what you'll be doing, but in the case we talked about where we only want to use the participants who are not in therapy, we'll ask it to organize output by groups. We'll select our therapy variable that we created before, where 1 equaled yes, 2 equals no, and we'll select or split the file based on therapy. When we do this, and we look at, for example, just our descriptive statistics for optimism and, let's say, depression at time 1, and we click OK, we can see that for those not in therapy, coded as 1, we get a mean for optimism and depression here. We can see that for those who are in either type of therapy, which was coded as 2, recall, we get scores for optimism and depression here. What if you didn't want to simply compare the output of both groups? You could go to Data, and instead of Split File, we'll come into this and turn it off. Right? Remember, always come back if you want to look at all the data again. Click OK. But we'll come back to Data and select Cases. In this case, we'll select if the condition satisfies some type. Here we'll move to our therapy scores, and we'll only look at participants who are in therapy. So we'll say select cases if therapy equals 2. Remember, 2 is our code for whether they're in either type of therapy, and continue. Importantly, under the output, you want to be sure not to choose this delete unselected cases. If you choose this, it will delete all the people in your data set who are not in therapy. That's a bad thing. So we'll choose OK, and again come back to simple descriptive statistics. And what we can see, it shows us the descriptive statistics. Notice that this is only the means, or only the people in the sample who are in therapy, but there's nothing in the file to tell you that other than the code up here that says it was filtered only for those who are in therapy. So it's important to be careful about this type of tool, because you can easily forget which sample you're looking at. You can easily delete unselected cases, but if you're careful with using the tool, it's a very helpful way of splitting files or selecting only certain cases within that file. Alright, the final 2 steps I want to show you in this video are about printing, or about using this output in other ways. Sometimes in SPSS, these output tables, this one is short, but sometimes they'll be very, very long, and there's a way to save paper and shrink the table. To do this, you double click on any table and then right click it. From here, choose Table Properties, and once it opens, you'll see a number of tabs up at the top, and the relevant one for us is Printing. You now see these 2 checkboxes. You can rescale a wide table. If the table is very wide, much longer than it would be for a single page, you can select Rescale the wide table to fit the page. Or if it's a very long table, you can rescale this long table to fit the page. Now when you select OK, you'll notice that it doesn't change in SPSS itself. But when this prints the output page, it'll make it fit the page so it doesn't go on and on. Lastly, some people like to print in Word. One easy way to do this is to export your data instead of simply saving it. From here you can select the file type, right? Microsoft Word is a common one, or PowerPoint even, or HTML. Right? You'll have to tell it where to save it on the desktop, for example. Right? Give it a file name. In this case I've listed fake, just because it's a sample video. Whenever you export this to a Word document, it'll create a new document that shows up on your computer. The document won't open right away as soon as you click OK, so after you click OK, for example, it'll create it. You can actually see that it created it on my desktop down here. But there's nothing, it doesn't open automatically, so you won't see this directly. Now, I've shown you lots of tools today for how to use SPSS, how to standardize, recode, and center variables. I've also shown you how to create composite scores and select cases, as well as useful printing tips.